Welcome to the Political Institutions and Political Economy PIPE workshop at the Bedrosian Center here in the Price School at the University of Southern California. I'm Jeff Jenkins, the director of the Bedrosian Center and the Price Collaborative. And our workshop speakers today are Leticia Arroyo and Noel Maurer. Leticia Arroyo is an associate professor of economics at the City University of New York, Queens College. She's an economic historian who specializes in the long-term economic development of the Americas. Her research agenda answers questions about development and growth in historical perspective, which she explores with a special focus on the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Noel Maurer is an associate professor of international affairs and international business at the George Washington University. His primary research interest involves how governments make commitments to protect property rights, as well as how private businesses defend their property rights under political instability. Leticia and Noel's presentation today is entitled When Interventions Fail, Lessons from the United States Experience in Latin America. Following the presentation, we'll have a formal discussant, Jane Esberg from Princeton University's Empirical Studies of Conflict Project, to provide some comments. During today's talk, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box or the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring questions and assessing whether they should be asked immediately or can wait until the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I give you Leticia and Noel.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you. Greetings from our living room. This presentation, or in fact, this entire paper, which is very short, is a true Instapaper. We actually began writing the day of the US pullout from Latin America. We had done some of the research for previous projects. Some of the data sets were putting together for unrelated projects, but we were inspired, probably not the right
disturbed by the situation
to basically write this paper. So the motivation was the chaotic American pullout from Afghanistan. The United States had a presence in Afghanistan for roughly 20 years. For a large part of that, the US was not officially running the Afghan government, but was highly subsidizing it and was involved in all aspects of governance from top to bottom. US strategic goals in Afghanistan changed over the course of the intervention, but from around 2004 onwards, they essentially settled on three aims. The first was to improve state capacity, that is, give the Afghan government the ability to carry out governing functions across its entire national territory. The second is to maintain political stability. The regime and constitutional structures that had been put in place in 2006, the US wished to see them survive. And finally, to end political violence, that is to say, to end the state of war, or at least reduce political violence below the level of war to something more tolerable that didn't threaten the state. As we all know, none of these aims were accomplished during the 20 years of the American presence in Afghanistan. And so we were wondering if this story is typical of American foreign interventions, or if it is a special case. Was there something about Afghanistan that either mistakes the US had made or something about the country that made it mission impossible? You could, of course, look at recent American interventions. By recent, we really mean from 1983 onwards. But those are very heterogeneous. They're very dispersed across space. They're very dispersed across time, with the exceptions of the two in the Middle East and Haiti in '94. They usually were about reinstalling regimes that had fallen out of power, so Grenada and Panama. And it's not really clear, given the just heterogeneity of this, that you could actually draw any conclusions from the American experience. This is where I am channeling you to not quote random military officers. All right, perfect. What did occur to us, based on previous work, however, is that there is a historical episode where the United States did intervene multiple times in multiple countries using a similar strategy but where the cases were not so heterogeneous and where the reasons all had a singular common motivation that might allow us to, at the very least, get some empirical grip on what was the result of American interventions in other foreign states. And this is Latin America during the first third of the 20th century. Between 1905 and 1934, the US intervenes multiple times in multiple countries. The impetus for these interventions, which we'll get to in a moment in our historical section, is fear of Germany. This is surprisingly strong and persists for a surprisingly long time, but the record is fairly clear. We have a large amount of evidence, both historical and quantitative, some of which we'll present, that these interventions have nothing to do with debt enforcement, ensuring the repayment of debt, or really anything to do with bondholders at all. They are, from a historian's point of view, peripherally related to protecting American foreign investments, but again, direct investments, that is to say, American mines, American farmers, and American people on the ground. But we'll also present some evidence that that is actually fairly incidental. These interventions, with a common motivation, then took on sort of three different flavors, which we have to distinguish between in the paper. So you have brief military interventions, almost all around the protection of American lives or property. You've also got some longer civilian-led interventions where American officials, usually at the invitation of a local government, although in some cases that is a local government that the US had installed, invite Americans in to run chunks of their governing structure, to in essence hand over parts of the state to American officials. And the final one are sort of these prolonged civil military interventions where you switch off between having American officials essentially running parts of foreign states. American troops are on the ground sometimes and sometimes not. The line between these three, as you'll see, is very vague and it is very hard to distinguish. So in this talk, what we're going to do is we're going to present our findings. What did we discover about the results of these foreign intervention in terms of expanding state capacity, promoting political stability, and reducing the background level of violence. We'll go a little bit into the history of this, or of these, and again, in an attempt to convince you that these were about preventing German intervention, and that some of them at least are very comparable to what the United States was attempting to do in Afghanistan. We'll run in painful depth through our empirics, the quantitative evidence that we've mustered, and then we'll end with some concluding remarks. And I'm hoping you will jump in when I go.
Well, we have a disclaimer, right, to the audience. We have a plea, right? So basically, we were trying to take advantage of all this data that we have painfully gathered and just apply it to the situation and just submit it. As some of you have seen the paper, it's a short paper. Not because we don't have enough to say, it's because we just want to submit it to APSR letters. So we would like to hear from you, and we would like to be referee 1.5, not 1, not 2, but 1.5, I think it's right. So to see whether you see this connection in terms of external validity of the historical experience in comparison with Afghanistan. And of course, it's social sciences, and we do know that there are severe indigeneity issues that we'll try to resolve. We have been really just thinking a lot about instruments and failing. So if you have any ideas about instruments, please share, don't be mean. But overall, we would like to hear what you thought about this, and in terms of like aiming this as a short paper that has a very distinct point. So thank you for your attention.
And we should also point out that even though we both do bring comparative advantages to this particular study, for example, I have a comparative advantage in causing computer programs to hang and in making electronic equipment mysteriously fail. We both pretty much contributed equally to this paper, so you will see us continuously correcting each other's mistakes and misrepresentations as this goes along, which mostly means that she will be correcting me. So to briefly go over our findings, we find, first of all, that US intervention almost unequivocally decreases state capacity. Our measure of state capacity is the ability to correct customs revenue. The reason why this is particularly useful is, first, all of these states depended largely on customs for their fiscal revenue, but because you can actually easily measure two things. One is the denominator, the flow of resources that the state is trying to extract for its own purposes. You can verify this because you can look at this flow using data from the countries that that state is trading with. Finally, you can actually fairly easily, we do this very simply in the paper, just did tariff rates go up or down, but you can fairly easily adjust for changes in the overall tax burden on this flow of goods. And by that measure, we find, to our surprise, that American interventions unequivocally reduce state capacity. We do find that they stabilize governments. The incidence of coups and attempted coups does drop while American civilians and military personnel are in place. However, the effect is slower than one might think. This result is robust to throwing out the cases of the Dominican Republic between 16 and 22 and Cuba between 06 and 09, which are the only two interventions where the Americans set up an actual occupation government formally, and during which I suppose coups or attempted coups have no meaning because there is no local government to displace. So our results are robust to essentially throwing out those two cases. Finally, we find, perhaps unsurprisingly, that US intervention is associated with increased violence. Again, we measure violence, unfortunately, by an indicator variable. There are death measures, but they're terrible. However, we are able to both use conflicts that reach the 1,000 battle death threshold. We started with correlates of war. We added 9 conflicts that do indeed meet that threshold and are recognized in the historical literature, but which the COW database missed. These results decrease state capacity while Americans are on the ground. Stabilization, but not great, and over time, and no change in the background level of violence or perhaps an increase. These are consistent with the American experience in Afghanistan. There are wrinkles, which we will talk about in our conclusion, but I also want to be clear about what we're not doing in this paper. We are not evaluating medium or long-term impacts of American intervention. The reason for this in the medium term is we are working with some data constraints. We are currently trying to get a reasonable set of both revenue and economic controls for the 1930s and 40s. And we are trying to make sure that we have identified all attempted coups in Latin America during this period. But we haven't yet completed that. As for looking at long-term impacts, we're both on record as being extraordinarily skeptical of the persistence literature in general. But
we did it because someone's going to ask. I said, someone's going to ask, what happened?
And what did we find?
Nothing.
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 So there's no discernible long-term effects from a
and
country.
we looked after 1915 until 2010. So for all the variables here. So just in case someone is curious, we found no remnants of these interventions having any effect on these outcomes.
So this period of American interventionism, it starts in the early 20th century, and it is motivated by fear of German expansion. This starts to become, during the Theodore Roosevelt administration, almost an overriding concern. You can find document over document of American governments concerned about it. The actual impetus for the first US intervention is in the Dominican Republic, when in 1903, about 4 years into a fairly brutal civil war, American intelligence agents receive reports that the Dominican regime is making open appeals to German officials stating, we will lease or sell you a naval base at Samana in return for financial and military support. The government falls before the Americans intervene, but that just switches the locus of concern. Now Americans are concerned and receive tangible reports, intercepted letters to be specific, of insurgent requests to the Germans for financial and military support. One of the biggest insurgent strategies during this period to get resources is to sack the customs houses. You've got revenue and goods there. You organize a military expedition, you take them over, you seize both the cash on hand and any of the goods that are there. A group of American naval officers, as well as the president Morales of the Dominican Republic, get the idea that if you could hand the custom houses over to the Americans, you would essentially accomplish two things. One is you would remove this source of resources from the insurgents. And second, since the Americans would be less corrupt and better able to run these complicated organizations, you would increase revenue for free, essentially, to the Dominican state. You would increase Dominican state capacity. We want to just point out here, and we could go over this again and again, that when the US finally gets the go-ahead for this intervention, so when it finally happens in January 1905, where we ride into the support of the Dominican government, it is accompanied by a massive haircut on Dominican debt, where the US sits down private bondholders and tells them, we're in charge now. The Dominicans can't pay this. They're not going to. We don't want them to. And you're going to take a haircut, which we calculated to be about 57% of the net present value of the Dominican Republic's outstanding external debt at the time. This would put it in, I believe, like the top 15th percentile of all sovereign haircuts since 1970.
Nice? I mean, as Argentinian, wouldn't that be nice? You know, it would be great. Forget that. We could use that.
Yeah. As someone who's not yet Argentine, I don't know if I should comment about that. But yes. So, and this story is a repeated pattern in these interventions. So these interventions are actually accompanied by substantial debt relief on the part of the United States, where the U.S. is intervening in these countries and now has a stake in their success, and basically tells bondholders to go screw themselves. And this happens over and over again, and bondholders don't like it. But that might be a different, completely different paper. What the Americans do in the Dominican Republic is American officials are stationed in the customs houses. The American Marines are also stationed in the customs houses. The U.S. organizes a new border patrol to patrol the Haitian border and the littoral. This is in part to collect customs and in part to deny the insurgents the ability to operate across the Haitian border. These reorganizations are fairly extensive. And the Dominican story then proceeds to get rolled out again and again. What this chart attempts to do is it shows a list of all Latin American countries. On the horizontal axis, you have years from 1904 to 1935, and then you have the years in which Americans are on the ground, grouped by the kind of intervention. But I do, while we do these experiments, I don't want to make too much of this. So for example, we have interventions where you have civilian authority, no combat forces present. That does not mean there was not an American military presence. They would have legation guards or Marines stationed in customs houses. It just means they're not fighting, and that if you were a US soldier, you did not receive a combat ribbon for being deployed in these areas. Similarly, the military deployments, or the ones where we say both, again, except for the Dominican Republic, where there's actually a US military government, and briefly in Cuba in 06 to 09, where there's an American civilian administrator. In most of these cases, there are civilians deeply embedded in the governing structure of these nations. So other than Mexico, where there are partial interventions, which are just American troops running around essentially trying to deny weapons from Germany to the Huerta regime, and then later on just doing something about Pancho Villa, which even General Pershing is not clear on. These interventions all look very similar, and the line between a civilian intervention and a military one is thoroughly blurred. The motivations vary, but less than one might think. Preventing German interference from the historical literature, and when we say this, we mean looking at primary documents, getting into the State Department files and actually sort of seeing what the State Department was communicating to the American government, as well as looking through the secondary literature of what administration officials said they thought they were doing, you can find that most of these were actually about preventing German intervention. There's a few which are not. Cuba in 06-09, that the Cuban government simply disintegrates in the wake of a fraudulent election. This happens while Taft is at the Secretary of War. William Howard Taft is actually on the ground in Cuba, and he just prints up letterhead declaring himself the head of the provisional government of the Republic of Cuba. But even there, German intervention is in the background.
But yeah, so even if it's not a direct trigger, so there was this kind of blanket of distrust that the Germans were going to come and get their backyard, well, my backyard, I'm American, well, the Monroe Doctrine in practice was just, we're just going to protect this from the Germans that are dangerous.
And what is weird about this, and here I want to hand the mic over to Professor Abad briefly, is that this concern outlasts the German defeat in World War I.
I mean, maybe they had a point, so this is from, it just made it to the New York Times. So, if it made it to the New York Times, it has to be true. So there was this case of a spy that was found in Chile and tried to commit suicide. So it's very Latin American, I feel. So it's like a telenovela. So apparently there was this letter that was intercepted and someone opened it using a really just very advanced method that is basically using I obsessively read over this story. Just open it using Steam, and then they found out that this was a spy and just was incarcerated and tried to commit suicide, but he was caught, and then he just confessed that he was a spy for the Germans. So this is, even though it's very telenovela-esque, it seems that there was a lot of evidence that German penetration in different Latin American countries during this period of time was actually a fact, and not so much in the imaginary of US government.
The State Department and the Military Intelligence Division are filled with documents of this time calling Chile so deeply penetrated by German agents that it is a de facto central power, and are very much worried that Chile is going to destabilize Peru, and that is going to have adverse impacts on American strategic interests. It's somewhat unclear what those strategic interests were, but that is also not different from today. So you get the rather surprising result of the United States intervening in Peru, essentially backing Agustin Leguia's coup, backing his government. Leguia then puts Americans in charge of the Navy, in charge of the Customs Service, invites in American teams. Similar thing happens in Bolivia, although there it's just a civilian team in charge of Bolivia's revenue agencies. But with the singular exception of this strange event in Ecuador in 25 to 28, all of these seem to have fear of Germany lurking in the background. And that's going to be useful for us econometrically when we search for some sort of instrument that might allow us to tease out exogeneity.
Let's talk data. So this is, our data set is the Blood, Sweat, and Tears panel that covers around 20 Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, depending on the specification. And it's just from late 1890s to 1929. We just want to escape the Great Depression for many reasons. And our main three outcomes are, as we talked in the introduction, is one is the proxy for state capacity, and we operationalize that by using the real customs revenue per capita. As Noel explained before, Latin American government's main source of revenue was from customs office. The switch towards sales tax or value-added taxes is much later, like a few decades later. So we're confident that this is capturing the main source of revenue for the government. In terms of political stability, we just coded up all the coups and attempts of coups. We started from many sources, and then we started from we don't have enough time. And then, which is in terms of violence, we started with correlates of war, and then we added some wars that were missing from the data set from also many sources. So those are, so that you keep in mind. So we have three main indicators trying to capture these three different dimensions that we want to evaluate the success or not. Well, actually not, which is already says in on the title of US interventions. The treatment is basically one variable that is an indicator variable that adopts the value of 1 when the US intervene in that country in that particular year. And this takes two varieties, which is put them together for reasons that Noel explained, that is not really easy to actually say, hey, troops on the ground versus taking care of, taking over the customs office. So we have both things piled up in the intervention treatment variable. In some specifications, we also use duration, so how many years the US had intervened that country. We have as many controls as history allows us to have. So we have GDP per capita, we have rainfall, we have the presence of the Royal Navy that is taken from Noel's really hefty book about the empire. So those are the main controls that we have.
A lot of the GDP estimates were also created for other projects from us. These are, you can't find off the shelf GDP estimates for a lot of these countries before 1920.
Yeah, so so the Madison project tries to do it, but for Central American countries and Caribbean countries, it's really hard. So we just did using our macroeconomic knowledge, try to proxy it. So I would not use it as an outcome per se, but as a control, I think that we're okay. So our empirical strategy, basically what it does is just takes advantage of the geographical and temporal variation of intervention in the US. So we just want to look whether when the US actually intervened in a given country in a given year, whether that had some bite. And we have one of them in the specification, going back to the previous slide. So I just want to make sure that people understand. So we have the variable intervention, the treatment variable, but also we lag it because this is a dynamic process. So we want to actually look, and for endogeneity issues as well, that we'll discuss a little bit more later, just what if there are differential effects, unprecise or not, about the US arriving in terms of intervention and the ongoing intervention and when the US leaves. So overall, what we find that we already previewed for you is that from in terms of revenue, the US intervention didn't do much for these countries. And the cells that are shaded are just the ones that are really, really significant. So it makes us happy.
That's the question. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, it's actually a question that I see is already in the chat too, but I'm just trying to understand your setup here. So the control group, so you're not looking at a set of countries as controls that were not intervened in. You're just looking at variation within the ones that are all in.
No, we'll actually do both. So we start here. This is a panel of all 20 countries, including the ones that are not intervened. Later on in a moment, we'll show you a robustness check that anticipates this concern, where someone might argue the non-intervened countries are just too different. So we also run these regressions conditional on having had an intervention at some point.
Okay.
We get basically the same.
Yeah, so basically our main specification takes into account all the Latin American Caribbean countries for which we had data for. The only exception is Paraguay, because believe it or not, the terms of trade of Paraguay are really, really hard to estimate because the main export is yerba mate, which is like
good price index.
another price index for this time period. So unfortunately, my neighbor Paraguay is excluded for the sample, which pains me, but we do what we can do. So to make it clear, our main specification takes into account all the Latin American Caribbean countries, and basically we're interested in just looking at the concomitant intervention and also when the US was there before or the US actually just left. So what you can see here, because I know that in political science you like pretty pictures, economists are more boring and just with like tables, but we have tables too for people that prefer tables. So these are our three main outcomes, and as you can see for revenue, when the US arrives, is just you see immediately that that the revenue just collapses. And when the US keeps on staying there, the revenue just like keeps on going down. It's just like if that keeps on giving. In terms of coups, when the US arrives, we see an increase in the probability of coups. So we do for coups and for wars as an indicator variable. So what we're calculating here, for those of you that want to know, is a linear probability model. You can challenge me about that, and we'll talk about that extensively later on. And then in terms of war, when the US arrives, there's an increase in the probability of war. Now, when we take into account the US being there in the previous period, what we have is that if you just look at the net sum of the two coefficients for coup, we have that the US decreases the probability of coup just by a little bit.
So essentially what we're picking up is a large amount of political instability when the US arrives. And of course, that means that we might be dealing with a problem of endogeneity, that governments are collapsing. You're in a period that is very unstable. War has broken out, and that is what is attracting American intervention. We have not, unfortunately, been able to come up with a good instrument to necessarily deal with that.
John.
Another question?
Yeah.
And just a clarifying question. So on the revenue point, minus 0.19, does that mean 20% fall in revenue? What does that number mean?
Well, it's
Yes.
17%.
Okay, and then the coup thing, does that mean it's hard to read on the screen, but does that mean 20%?
Increase in the probability of a coup
Probability.
occurring that year, yes.
Okay, I'm trying to make sure I understand what the number is. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's probability of a coup or a coup attempt.
Okay,
So
but it's 20%. It's 20%.
20,
Higher,
yeah,
yeah.
20% higher. But if you just take into account if the US had been there the year before, so there is a decrease of like 3% of the probability of that country experiencing a coup or an attempt at coup for that year.
Wait, okay, so now I'm confused. So, it's 20% off a 3% base. Is that the way to think about it?
So there are two. There's one direct effect. So if the US arrives that year, so the probability of that country experiencing a coup or an attempt at coup increases 24%. But if the US had been in that country the year before, then the net effect is a decrease of 3% in the probability of coup or attempt at coup.
So essentially what you're saying is that there's instability in the year the Americans arrive.
Right, and that's an annual number. So that means there's a 1 in 4 chance of a coup in the year the US. It goes up, well, whatever baseline level is, it goes up to. Is that the way to think about it per year?
Exactly. And since it's a fixed effect specification, it's sort of the baseline for that country spikes up. In that.
Thank you.
We can, for revenue, we do have an instrument that works fairly well, which is distance to Germany. And you may be wondering how countries change their distance, but there we're in luck that the Panama Canal opens to full commercial operation in June of 1920. And that functionally moves a lot of Latin America closer to Germany. It doesn't have any problem for us with the exclusion restriction for a number of different reasons. One of which is that these countries almost barely traded with Germany at all. Second, any effect you would have expected to be in the direction of increasing revenue. And so moving closer to Hamburg, which was our indicator variable, or our instrument, would have no effect on customs revenue, unless you really wanted to believe that there was trade diversion. We've run a gravity model with using bilateral trade as much as we can find and get nothing. But it would make it much more relevant for Germans and German agents to want to intervene or interfere in that country. This works for revenue. This doesn't satisfy the exclusion restriction for coups or for war, simply because you could expect that distance to Germany increases German political interference, and that could trigger political instability directly. So we have not come up with a good way to directly deal, at least with the reverse causality part of endogeneity for our results on coup and for war. But Professor Abad did come up with a different way of dealing with endogeneity.
There's some ways that we can deal with some kind of reverse causality issue. So one is to look at different samples. So one is like, okay, so let's just look at only the countries that were intervened at some point, because the US never really had the capacity or the will to intervene in my other home country, Argentina. A fact that Argentina just kind of took for granted when, the UK actually did invade the Malvinas. But at that point
defend.
but just just stop. So he just doesn't want to actually work with me anymore. So we just limited the sample to only the intervened countries, and then we also just only in just the other sample that we looked at is just excluding Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile. So those are the other two samples, and our results actually hold. So the other issues that you can raise, and we try to preemptively defend ourselves, is that rumor has it that if you have very few clusters, then your standard errors are fictional. So supposedly the magic number is 35 because normal and normality, things like that kick in. So, but what we did is bootstrapped our standard errors, and the results for us still hold. And then finally, because we have this pervading and persisting endogeneity issue that we haven't been able to solve. So we are thinking in terms of like, oh, what are we missing in terms of omitted variable bias that could invalidate our results? So one of the exercises that we are very fond of doing is that has been pioneered by Altonji and Miguel, is to actually look what's called selectional on unobservables. So this is kind of fun to do it. So what you do is like first you run an unconstrained regression, and where you put only the treatment variables, right? And then you just capture the coefficients. And then you start adding the control sequentially to see what kind of coefficients you get relative to the unconstrained regression. And then you just take the ratio of that, you know, whatever I said in the last minute can be summarized with like really, really nice algebra there on the left-hand side. And what we find is that for our three specifications, the omitted variables that are correlated with what we actually observe, the observable variables, they have to be between 1 to 3 times bigger than what we observe in order to actually do away with the OLS results that we have presented to all of you.
Now, this deals with endogeneity of the emitted variable kind. It doesn't deal with reverse causality, but one of the things about the question we're asking in this paper, which is what is the result of US intervention, is to some extent, we don't care. That's not the question we're asking. If US intervention causes an increase in war, which is what we seem to find, or
the US
if an
goes
increase
there,
in war,
or because the US goes there because there is war.
but is incapable of
Yeah.
actually doing anything about it, to some extent for the question we're asking, which is, was the Afghan experience an outlier? Does the US have any record of creating peace in the areas that it's intervened? We almost don't care. It's a fascinating question, but it doesn't directly affect our argument. So basically, to sum up, what we find out is that the US did reduce violence slightly. It's not a super strong result. We do have another specification, which we didn't include, where we use intervention and then the duration of intervention. And you do find there's some reduction over time in violence. It seems to be statistically significant, but it's not a strong result. We do find that they did stabilize governments. The incidence of coups and attempted coups does go down substantially. And we find that state capacity strongly appears to have gotten worse. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence we're happy to get into in questions that backs this up, and we have some hypotheses as to why. However, just to sum up for the lessons of Afghanistan, and here I should say I was with the Jalalabad Provincial Reconstruction Team in 06, 07, and one of the things that drove us crazy was that Americans were not directly in the chain of command of Afghan institutions. So if you find an Afghan national police officer is not releasing equipment to their personnel or is stealing, you can't just fire them. You have no authority over them. You have to pretend you do, bluster. And this reached the point where Carl Eikenberry, and if any of you quote this, I will deny it because he will deny it, said to me in frustration, I wish this were the 1920s and we could just get a League of Nations mandate. Our findings of interventions where the US did install its own personnel in the chain of command, where the US did take over the Peruvian Navy and took over with the ability to hire and fire the Peruvian Customs Service and took over the Peruvian military under only a Peruvian sovereign president, but where American officials were there, it does not seem to have had any effect and may have made things worse. The second is that the US massively subsidized the Afghan government directly And in the historical cases, this only happened in Nicaragua, where Congress did vote unprecedented amounts of foreign aid to the Nicaraguan government in the teens and 20s. But in the other cases, the US is not providing any direct fiscal support to these governments. That also does not appear to have made a difference. The Afghan government would have been weak even if we had not given it more support than it could handle, even if we had not given it this crutch. Ironically enough, in terms of the history, and I'm just going to say this and then hand it over, Nicaragua is the case that most resembles Afghanistan, all the way down to a tumultuous departure that involves Agustin Sandino giving a very sardonic wave to the departing troops. We actually depart twice, and both times the government that we install lasts a little bit longer than the one we left in Afghanistan, but not by a whole much. And ironically, that is also the intervention that both in terms of time and strategy most resembles Afghanistan. And with that, we want to thank you for the opportunity.
That's a great picture.
And
There we go.
hand over.
Dominican Republic.
Oh, terrific.
Thank you.
Terrific. So as I mentioned, we have a formal discussant. It's Jane Esberg from Princeton, and I'll turn it over to you, Jane.
So, I mean, this is clearly a really interesting paper and extremely relevant. It's also written really engagingly. It's some of the most fun that I think I've had reading a paper in a long time. Yeah, I mean, the argument is made very clearly. It's obviously, again, really policy relevant. And I think you do a really clear job working through alternative explanations. So I'm going to break my comments into two. So the first set is going to be more theoretical, and the second set is really about the quantitative results. So on the theoretical side, I think the main tension is about what you're trying to argue precisely. So I get the idea overall of these kind of failed interventions, but there are kind of three different flavors that appear in the paper. So one is that an intervention makes a state less stable long-term, which is much more the kind of Afghanistan effect that, you know, when you pull out, then you're basically left with a state that can't necessarily sustain itself. The second is that states actually get actively weaker during intervention, which, based on the fact that you're using your main indicator, your main treatment variable is the years of intervention, seems to be really what you're testing empirically. And then the third is kind of is a bit weaker a statement than both, which is really that intervention clearly doesn't accomplish its own stated goals, that at the end of this case, you don't necessarily get what the US claims to want out of their intervention. And at points you make that case as well. And these are subtle differences, but I do think that they're pretty important because whether you want to kind of tie it much more closely to Afghanistan and the idea that that rapid collapse shows that the US hasn't actually been able to strengthen the state, versus kind of what's going on in the empirics. And then I was also missing a time dimension to your theory, which I think will also kind of help the empirics, which I'll discuss a bit later. So you do some tests to show that results are similar without short-lived interventions, but I see pretty compelling theoretical reasons to think about the time effects more broadly. There are kind of two dimensions of this. First, I think that there needs to be some explanation for when the US does actually decide to stay longer in these interventions. You know, why do they have these single one-off years of interventions versus these much longer periods? And second, some sense of when we should start seeing weakening or strength, you know, all of these results, and when should these results actually come into play? Is it the first year of intervention? Is it the fifth year of intervention? Are there going to be these time dimensions to how long the US stays? I might actually think that, you know, and you preview this a little bit in your results, that I would think that any effects in the first year of intervention are probably going to be more of a reflection of the causes of intervention. But after the first year, we might expect that to actually be a reflection of what's going on in this state, you know, under US control more formally. I'd also probably cut down on the Afghanistan discussion in the abstract in particular, because I think it in some ways kind of undersells the contribution of the paper, which is a question about kind of US imperialism more broadly, rather than just linked to a single case. And in that way, I think you're actually telling, you know, Afghanistan is obviously going to be something that haunts us for a long time, but in some ways you're telling a more timeless story than that. And I think that really kind of decoupling it a little bit from Afghanistan can also help with the question about case selection if you're going for something broader about US colonialism. So Latin America is obviously a little special because it's America's nearest neighbor, and that makes it particularly vulnerable to this particular type of incursion. And there are going to be a number of questions about what regional variation in intervention looks like and how motives for intervention vary. And there's also a kind of selection effect that goes in a kind of different way than you would expect, which is that during this time period, or at least if you kind of include the 10 years before this period, the US actually did an awful lot of intervention where they just stayed, right? So most relevant here maybe is Puerto Rico, but there are obviously a lot of cases that kind of remain as territories. And it makes you think, well, if the US, maybe the US goals in this case were just completely different, but it does raise this question of if the US actually succeeds in, quote unquote, pacifying countries, did they just stay? And now we just think of them as territories, and they just left when they felt like they failed. So moving on to the empirics, I think you're pretty aware of the major empirical questions, which revolve around this question of endogeneity and how do we tease out the effects of intervention separate from the dynamics of the countries that the US is intervening in. And I think that you do a very good job of addressing those questions very head on and being very transparent about them. I think there's still some additional steps that you can take where you can theorize and adjust the empirics to help make a case the case more convincing. I think my major empirical question reading it was why you didn't include country fixed effects rather than just year fixed effects, because to me, your theory is really a question of change within country. So did intervention create a change? You're nodding like maybe you did, and it just wasn't included in the paper model, maybe.
So the errors are clustered at the country level, which is it basically operates as country fixed effects. Because by clustering at the country level, basically you're just adjusting by heterogeneity with it,
Sure, but I still think that the kind of, including the country fixed effects will account for those time invariant characteristics and will give you the delta within country in a way that isn't accounted for just by including the clustered standard errors. And I do think that fundamentally this is really a question about change within countries. So did intervention create a change in these outcome variables following the US entering? And I think that that's probably intensifying the endogeneity concerns. And I think that that will also give you better opportunity to play with these time varying effects of intervention. So if you have two-way fixed effects, that can give you greater leverage to look at these overtime effects with something like an event study design. Mm-hmm. The endogeneity concerns don't necessarily go away, but you can more directly address this question of whether there were clear pre-trends in political violence or in revenue. And then you can really see about whether these are changes in the year of intervention, which suggests a kind of responsive intervention, or whether there are more sustained effects, which make it more clearly about the kind of overtime sustained effects of intervention itself. And then the instrument, I think that instruments are just inherently often kind of hard. And I think that I'd probably be more convinced by building up these other kind of types of evidence, and especially bringing in more qualitative evidence, since you clearly know a lot about these cases. The IV estimator is distance to Germany, and that changes with the opening of the Panama Canal. But because of that, you're really getting also some of these effects of the Panama Canal opening. So if you take Chile, that's, I think, a really clear case of, it has really heavy German influence. It probably gets closer to Germany, at the tip. But you also probably get quite a lot of lost revenue because you don't have ships having to pass around the Cape anymore. And that's in general going to kind of shift revenue quite a lot over all of these cases. So I think those are my main points, and I want to leave plenty of time for other participants to speak. So I'll stop there.
Do you guys want to respond to Jane at all? We have some time.
Sure. So we'll start.
So I'll say that I had the same question about the two-way fixed effects.
So we can start from the empirics and kind of move backwards. So including country fixed effects, that's fairly easy. For the revenue ones, we've done them.
It's just the same effect. It just actually, it gives exactly the same. Clustering the errors at the country level and just putting your fixed effects when we don't have multiple observations per country per year. It just actually They're philosophically different, mathematically, just they give you exactly the same result.
Pre-trends, but we've done it. It's
Yeah, we've
very
done
easy
it.
to.
No, but it's
include the
exactly the same.
results.
It's exactly the same to do it. Yeah.
The pre-trends is a great suggestion. It's also, and we'd love to talk more. We've done it for other papers. No two scholars seem to agree, as a matter of empirical strategy, just what accounting for pre-trends means. So we've often adjusted for sort of revenue in the 2 or 3 years before intervention, where we tried to do this for the revenue regressions. For the other ones, we didn't, because we weren't sure what to do with the indicator variable on that, but we can try. But any suggestions that you might have about how exactly to account for pre-trends, we would be delighted, because the literature is often really vague. Articles say we account for pre-trends, and then when you lift up the hood to see what happened, they're often referring to sort of dramatically different empirical strategies. And I have to say, I agree with you completely about the instrument, particularly in the case of Chile, which is one reason to throw out the ABCU countries. Chile is really actually quite affected by the opening of the Panama Canal. The Chilean iron industry gets a giant shot in the arm, because now Chilean iron is actually competitive in American steel factories, which is not true before the opening of the canal. And the industry gets supercharged. It's one of the few Latin American countries that actually sees a positive effect from the canal. We also agree with you that it's not necessarily the greatest instrument. We've just tried to do what we can. For the 1898 war, that's a really interesting question. I can talk too long, right? Because
we have time. We have some time.
I've written a book on American intervention regarding other things.
He also wrote a book on the Panama Canal. We can be here forever.
The 1898 war is really fascinating in that respect, in the sense that the United States does not fight it over either Puerto Rico or the Philippines. This is more pronounced in the case of the Philippines. Where it's like a tablet. I put my hand on it, figuring if I can't remember what happened in Nicaragua in 1920, I'm just going to put my hand on it and it'll come back to me. So the U.S. winds up expanding territorially in 1898, almost due to a lack of imagination. In the Philippines, what happens is the U.S. defeats the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. The only American casualty is a sailor who dies of a heart attack. Admiral Dewey first gives aid to the Filipino guerrillas who've been fighting the Spanish. He brings their leader from exile in Hong Kong actually back to Manila. This gets back to Washington. The McKinley administration says, well, we could really use a naval base because we're dependent on British coaling stations in the Pacific, and that's not good. The Navy turns around and says, sure, but we don't trust that the insurgents can actually run a government. And if you have an enclave in either Subic or Manila Bay, then the wreck that's going to be the rest of Luzon will just open up way too many opportunities for foreign intervention. So we need operational control of Luzon. At this point, McKinley's political advisors tell him, well, that's going to look really bad to the American public if we either hand the remainder back over to Spain or create a government in one part of the Philippines, but not in the part we're interested in. It's ironic and contradictory, but this is what the records show, because no one seems to think that annexing Puerto Rico is a problem. But the Philippines.
And I think that this deals with like the other comment is like,
So
if the US succeeds, then it stays. So in the case of the Philippines, there was another thing that was like, well, maybe we should throw the Philippines in, like, why not, right? But the US didn't want to annex the Philippines because of kind of discriminatory reasons.
Well, the US doesn't want to make the Philippines
Yeah.
part of the United States because of racism.
Yeah.
But what also happens is you get the American politics of the Philippines starts to become just really bizarre. And I could get into it But the short answer is nobody wants to do that again. There's a brutal war. It gets out in 1902. But even then it continues in Mindanao all the way into the teens. There's another outbreak of violence in the 1930s. The Filipino government is a mess. The US Congress is really worried that Americans will invest in the Philippines and therefore create a lobby that will keep the Philippines forever. This is the Democratic Party is concerned about this. So they pass laws basically restricting American investment in the Philippines. So you can't even make money there. You don't get the expected wave of American investment because Congress basically bans it. So essentially, nobody wants to repeat this experience. And then it's a political football that just keeps getting handed back and forth, where, as far as I can tell, as unsatisfying as this is, Republican politicians don't want the Philippines to become independent just because they think it'll look bad, that hey, they were holding the ball when they annexed this, and giving them independence will look bad. So you get these partisan fights about nothing, where no one wants to have the Philippines as a possession. Everybody's terrified that Filipinos might start arriving. And finally, what breaks that political logjam is nothing to do with the Philippines. It's the Depression happens. You get these riots in California where whites go into Filipino neighborhoods and massacre Filipino immigrants. And then you get this big push from Wisconsin and Minnesota where they suddenly start worrying about Filipino margarine and that this is killing their dairy industry. And in the context of the Depression, Hoover still vetoes all these independence bills for partisan reasons. I can't think of another reason. But finally, when Hoover's out and Roosevelt comes in, the Americans give the Philippines independence, even though at this point no Filipino politician wants it, but that's another story. So the Philippines are so sui generis, and Puerto Rico with less drama you can rope into the same story, that it's not clear to me that including them would be useful, nor is it clear that it would change the results. Professor Abad and I have another paper about American land reform efforts in the Philippines and why the US is utterly unable to bring formal titling to the Philippines. We dig down deep under the hood, but I think the key result here is a very optimistic bureaucrat in 1935 writes that, and this is optimistic, I'm not kidding, this is actually phrased optimistically, that we should have the whole country titled by the year 2124 if only we triple our efforts.
And a friend of mine at the World Bank that works for the Philippines, for the 10-year program at the Philippines, that they actually just are going to finish by 20, but they're going to finish now, but only because the World Bank gave them like a huge loan. A century ahead of schedule, a century ahead of when the Americans thought they were going to finish the job. Again, I probably talked way too much about the Philippines and a shaggy dog story, but the short version is 1898, the US doesn't leave because once you've annexed it, the politics becomes kind of impossible. You can't just do what the Coolidge administration tried and the Harding administration tried, and then the Roosevelt administration does, which is just declare victory and go home. And in the case of Nicaragua, that blows up in their faces quite badly. That we declare victory and go home, and then the government collapses incredibly rapidly. But that's just much harder to do when you're taking a formal possession, and that there's no, what would be the modern equivalent of that, of something? We've already seen in the Afghan war that it was almost no government wanted to be caught holding the bag and leaving. You just got to imagine those domestic political imperatives get tripled in the case of kind of leaving a formal possession, that all the normal coalitions you would think just get kind of scrambled.
Okay. So there's a question here from Stephen Hubbard, who looks like he's left, but he asks, have you considered using AI deep learning techniques on a far larger geopolitical data set to see if any branches are associated with significant negative or positive effects?
We have not. Really
It's like
have
exciting. It's
So
like-
far, I'm really just very bummed that this person left because I want to see like, how do we do this? I'm curious about I always like new toys to play with. So
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty intense toy there.
Try. What was the instrument we tried? We tried as
Oh,
an
we
instrument.
tried that,
This is
yeah.
like we tried as an instrument. We tried
engram.
mentions of Germany, negative mentions of Germany in newspapers, mentions of Germany and a country name. We tried to use that as an instrument.
And it's nothing.
It didn't work.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
So, I just had a basic question. Can you back out U.S. administration effects? You have what? TR, Taft, Wilson, and Harding and Coolidge. So you have all Republican administrations except Wilson, right?
that's it. So the short answer would be no. A longer answer would be yes, but administrations find themselves consistently incapable of carrying out their preferred policies. So Roosevelt is obviously an unabashed interventionist. He has no problems with intervention, although he is very explicit about not annexing anyone. That kind of no one wants to repeat 1898. Taft carries on that policy directly. The Wilson administration comes in with really no direct policy, except they are in favor of Philippine independence, but no real direct policy towards Latin America, but also winds up intervening when it feels that the stability of Latin American countries are threatened and that this poses a strategic threat to the United States. Warren Harding runs on an explicitly anti-interventionist platform in 1920. He's going to wrap all of this up and bring the troops home. And he does temporarily pull forces out of the Dominican Republic, out of Nicaragua, and out of Cuba. And in two of those three places, they're back before the administration is done. In fact, in two of those three places, they're back before the year is out. So he winds up utterly incapable of actually making this happen. And you have a very similar story with the Coolidge administration and the Hoover administration, all three of which are presumably anti-interventionist. They actually blame Wilson for this. They blame Roosevelt, but none of them are actually able to disengage the way that they all would like. So it's hard to see any on the ground administration effects, even though the stated policy of these administrations are all very different. The only thing I should add is they also don't line up with what you might expect politically. So to give an example, the Wilson administration talks a lot about democracy, but doesn't do anything. The Harding administration and the Coolidge administration are actually very serious about denying recognition to non-democratic countries, not recognizing military coups, and not leaving the places where intervened until you can actually hand the keys over to an elected government. This doesn't match what you would have expected, but it's really strongly in the record of what they do, and one of the reasons why they're trapped and they can't get out is they can't meet their own declared victory conditions for getting out. They're not willing to bear the political cost, and they think the cost of just continuing an intervention is less than the cost of letting it fail.
Some of the interventions most of the interventions were pretty cheap.
Yes,
Right?
no, that's true.
It's not.
That's true.
So, and the receiverships report shows things like, oh, and this year was even better than last year, and
You're looking at the numbers and going, the numbers don't say
Yeah.
that. The happy talk is
yeah,
there.
the happy talk is there all the time.
Oh.
So.
And what about fiscal costs, just to be clear here, is you have to, at this time, military intervention is a far less capital intensive operation than it is today. And the reports bear this out, where the reports to Congress essentially state the cost of maintaining a soldier or a Marine in the Dominican Republic is really not much more than the cost of maintaining that same soldier or Marine in the United States, and in some cases is less because food is cheaper. That has no parallel with military operations today.
So I have a question.
Nothing, like no comparison.
I can follow up on this because I think this Jeff's question is really interesting. The answer is really interesting too, which is a little bit more than what you're doing, but it does beg the question for what's the U.S. doing? What is its goals here? What is it getting out of this? One could say, well, it's just there's no logic to it all, and it's just stupidity. But that seems too simple to me. What I heard from the answer there, and it sounds right to me, is that if we're looking for the answer, we should not be looking at what presidents say, and we should not be looking at the parties. That doesn't seem to be the answer. That's kind of what I look at Afghanistan too. I think we're in a partisan age, but Trump wanted to get out and Biden wanted to get out, everybody wanted to get out. So this isn't a partisan issue. There's something else going in here, but it does beg the question, what is the underlying interest here, or the underlying interest in interest groups or something like that compel these actions? Again, it's a bit beyond what you guys are actually doing here, but we're at that part of the talk where we can speculate. So I'd be curious on your thoughts on that.
So I can do some brief speculation. I mean, one is that it looks bad if governments fall apart on your watch. The second is that there are.
But isn't that just going back to a president story again?
Yeah. Well, there's so.
I want a different story. I want a story that doesn't involve presidents at all.
Okay. Story that doesn't involve presidents at all. Okay. This involves interest groups. So for many of these interventions, they did not attract a lot of opposition in the United States at home for reasons similar to today, right? The fiscal cost was unnoticeable for different reasons, but it was still unnoticeable. The amount of soldiers involved was relatively low. You had an all-volunteer military. As far as we can tell, the percentage of Americans who'd served in the military was lower then than it even is today. But you did have that when troops were pulled out and chaos erupted, you would get outcries from either American residents of those countries or American owners of direct investments in those countries. And there's sort of this collective action problem where they can mobilize. The opposition to the war is relatively diffuse and vague and sort of across the entire electorate, where no one really likes any of this. But the support is highly concentrated, either among people who politically, for their own reasons, think they benefit from this, or people who have a direct stake and skin in the game. So you do see this explicitly. You see it in Cuba. You see it in Nicaragua when in 1931, the Secretary of State announces that American troops will no longer be protecting American residents of the Nicaraguan interior. They're not. They're going to be in Managua. They want to keep the government from falling. But if Sandino raids you, that's your problem. And they make a lot of noise. And congressional representatives who have no responsibility make a lot of noise. And so you can't eliminate presidents because they're the ones ultimately making the decision. But I think we often underestimate how much foreign policy resembles domestic policy, in the sense that it's subject to the collective action problem and to capture by focused interest groups.
Is there an outcome? It's easy for audience to tell you to add more variables, but is there an outcome variable you could look at which sort of captures financial interest, which sort of says, because it doesn't look like it's doing great on some of these other dimensions. Can you show, oh, this really protects these guys a bunch of ways or something?
We looked at bonds, bond yields, and yeah, so there was not much difference between the yields, if I remember right.
Well, what we got, event studies are empirically weak. So we had a result that was interesting, and we've been debating whether or not to hang a different paper on it, where bond yields of non-intervened countries react really positively when the US starts doing it. So the Dominican intervention, like that one shows up in the eyeball data. You don't need an event study. You can like watch Central American bonds like all shoot up. And then it goes down. And by the end, the announcement of another intervention is having like a small negative effect. It seems almost as if investors switch from thinking, oh, American imperialism is great to, oh Christ, not this again. If the US is going in, something must be wrong.
It seems that it's similar to happens today. It's like, the emerging market, like, some country in the emerging market world just, collapses or just does great. And then, since the tidal lifts all boats. And then, so it seems that there is like played with contagion effects in that sense. So what is good about that is that it's kind of, well, for historical reasons, like it's high frequency data, which is monthly. So it's not annual. More observations to play with. But still, it doesn't seem to be very convincing. And just as we talked before, just from a financial perspective, the US was very clear. It's like you're not going to harm these countries from a financial perspective, because that would actually feed into more instability.
And the stock of foreign direct investment, which is fairly well measured at this time, doesn't seem to have any effect on anything. We tried using it as an instrument. We tried using it as a control. We get nothing.
We don't see any results, that countries that want to intervene, that you have more investment or more foreign direct investment or more strategic foreign direct investment.
Or more bond issues. They don't get more external debt. I mean, that last one is not surprising given that interventions are often contained with the US government negotiating a giant haircut on the value of sovereign debt. The only interesting story we can tell is the Dominicans, they get the second biggest haircut, and they're the first intervention, and the bond markets like that one. Chris Michener had that article about that way back in, I think, 2000. That like
the other thing we looked at was trade, whether just intervening countries actually just saw some kind of increase in trade, because you're closer to the US in some way. And reduced by the commercial distance. And what we found only was from imports perspective that the US, this intervening countries imported a little bit more, but it was some kind of trade diversion, so it was no trade creation. So that is the only thing that we found. And those are results that are incredibly robust, because it's those, gravity models that are just like, gravity is just there. They're really, really sound, and it takes like 3 days to run. So with all the fixed effects.
So here
quick question on this, follow-up question. Do we have any numbers on number of foreign nationals from the various countries living in the United States during these years?
We actually do. We should. That's actually.
Well, we'll have to interpolate it. Right.
Or immigrants, foreign nationals. I mean, this would go to like an interest group story, right? Potentially a lobbying story.
I vaguely remember us trying that as an instrument, looking at sort of the number of Cubans in the United States.
The problem is that
these are a different paper, Jeff. This is not this paper.
But the problem is that we're not going to have huge variation, because we're going to have our census data. So they're going to have to interpolate. So we'll have 1900. So most of the observations are going to be interpolated, and I'm not sure how to think about that.
I think that would be interesting though, if you could get, if you could get interest variables or something in there, because one story is, well, this isn't doing very good for these countries, but it's serving some US interests, and therefore it's succeeding on these dimensions. That's one story. Now there's another story which is underlying what I think you're saying, which is that, well, this is just a screw up, and people really didn't kind of understand it, and they didn't know what they were doing, and they learned over time. And I wonder if you could actually say something about that one too. I mean, it's a little bit tricky. If you were trying to do a real causal analysis, you would say it violates some sort of assumption or something like that. But basically, if you observe something in one country at one time, people are learning from that, both American voters, politicians, as well as sort of activists on the ground in the countries. They're learning, oh, the US will run if we do this, or they won't run. And so you don't have a bunch of independent observations. You have a historical episode playing out in some sense. And I think it would be, and I think we all kind of believe that there's learning that goes on to some extent. It'd be interesting if you could get a hold of it in some sense and shed some light. And this isn't a criticism of what you're doing. I think what you're doing is interesting, but as far as the next dimension, instead of just treating these as a bunch of independent observations just come out there, if you can incorporate the learning in there and say something about who learns, does anybody learn, how does that work? And partly we stopped doing this at some point. You stopped doing this at some point. So it looks like at some point people more or less stopped doing it, at least in the big way that was done at that period. So it kind of looks like a story could be, well, people said, well, this actually is kind of a muck, doesn't really do what we thought it was. But if you could, be interesting to get some purchase on that, because you have all these data here, if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so the story that rolls out is usually a government becomes unstable. The US gets word that Germany is involved or German interests are involved on one side or another, and the US intervenes. That's sort of the short capsule version of all of these, with the exception of this strange Ecuadorian story. Which, yeah, she's laughing because we've thrown it out in some of our regressions because it's so weird.
Isn't that the one that's just like we're going to declare the 4th of July holiday?
No, that was Peru.
Oh, that was Peru.
That was Peru.
Yeah. And they just put like pictures of the US president.
No, pictures of James Madison. President
James Madison,
Ledea
yeah,
puts
so
a
James
giant
Madison.
picture of James Madison in his office.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. I think that's interesting. It's like it's hard to say. I mean, we clearly stop in the 1930s, and in part, it's the Roosevelt administration basically deciding two things. One is that it can totally afford to let bondholders go hang. It's like, we don't care. You've lost all. The Depression has killed any political power that you might have had. And it also abandons any thoughts about democracy promotion. It just doesn't care anymore about any of that. And then we don't do this again. There's a paper. I'm talking to political scientists, so I can criticize this paper. It's in the QJE. It's called Commercial Imperialism. It tries to look at post-war, what they call interventions, and it teases out a slight increase, similar to the one we found in our gravity model, of imports from the United States in countries that are, quote, intervened, unquote. So the nice thing about the QJE is they publish their data and you can go back and see their definitions. The bad thing is the definition's entirely specious. Some governments get classified on the basis of one book that was maybe assigned to undergraduates as being CIA supported, and it gets coded as having CIA support as long as that government is in power. Others get coded as just having a CIA intervention in the year when some data set or another says the CIA was involved. The results are easily destroyed. They're just not robust. And that's because until recently, the United States got out of the business of militarily occupying foreign countries. So I think the only real cases you can find this in the post-war era are going to be the post-war occupations after World War II, which are just not comparable to anything. South Vietnam, the Dominican in 65, Grenada in 83, Panama in 89. And Panama in 89 is so idiosyncratic.
Korea.
So Korea, but Korea is also an interesting one, right? You have the occupation government, which is really similar to Japan, right? So you have the military government that's there till 48. And that's clearly part of the Japanese post-war occupation. They give the keys over to Rhee's government, and I suppose you could call Korea that.
But I guess one reason that the learning pops into my head is because I think the U.S. spent a generation or so trying to learn whatever lesson there was out of Vietnam. It clearly overhung to a huge extent the way people thought. So if you just took Vietnam as an observation and then you looked at the next 20 years, it's just independent draws, you would miss there was some learning there. I don't know what the learning was, but it was clear that it was in people's mind. And I don't know this other period, but were there some of these episodes that were particularly got a lot of media attention and seemed like they were learning teachable events or something like that?
Nicaraguan. Yeah, for some reason, the Nicaraguan one.
Nicaragua was a big one in that.
Nicaragua gets a huge amount of attention. I don't quite know why. I mean, I suspect racism, right? Haiti is there. The Marines are there. They're fighting a guerrilla war. There's a Haitian government. We're there forever and a day. It gets a lot of attention in the United States, where I don't know, the stories get so complicated, where politicians think that the involvement in Haiti is actually popular among African Americans. We have no direct evidence of whether this is true or not, but they believe that it is, and that pulling out would be viewed poorly, and you could lose Black votes, particularly in northern states like New York, where it's key. And politicians do. McPherson's book is sort of loaded with politicians saying we'd like to leave Haiti, but we'll lose the African American vote, the Black vote, if we do. And in Nicaragua, it gets a lot of play, as far as I can tell, because Sandino's a media genius, and he publicizes all of his actions in the United States and gets viewed as this, dashing, majestic figure, to the point where when he ambushes and kills a bunch of Marines in 1930 in sort of a perfectly executed ambush, where he essentially cuts off these Marines from their supply routes, and then this is, in fact, I was in the Army, is showing, right? I get too interested in this. And then basically destroys them in detail. This gets reported positively in the American press. And this is something actually that the Hoover administration doesn't think of it as like, oh, Americans are mad because the insurgents just beat all these Marines. It's like, oh, Americans are mad now because a bunch of Marines died against fighting this romantic Robin Hood figure who's fighting to be the George Washington of Nicaragua. And again, we don't have public opinion polling, but the papers and editorial boards all like turn sharply against the intervention after this defeat of these Marines, which has no strategic import whatsoever, but just somehow gets on the front pages of the press, because I guess the Marines are doing happy talk about how they're fighting bandits, and it's not really it's not action insurgency, and then they can't keep that up. And Sandino, this is where the having local exiles, Sandino manages to get among Cuban and Nicaraguan exiles in New York, manages to get his exploits popularized, and then gets correspondents to follow him, and he just becomes kind of a Che Guevara pop figure. And that, but that doesn't happen in the Dominican Republic, like, or even in Haiti, where, as far as I can tell, no one like knew or cared even really that these interventions were happening.
So of course the Philippines is in the news a huge amount, right? I mean, it's outside of but that doesn't seem to lead to much learning vis-a-vis Latin America. Doesn't seem like.
Well, in part we have sovereignty in the Philippines, right? So you do get one learning in the sense that after the Foraker Act bans American investment in the Philippines, bans is too strong a word, but strongly limits it. After that, there is zero pressure from American overseas investment for annexation. And the logic is very clear. If the United States annexes a foreign territory, the Constitution will not be extended because racism. But if the Constitution isn't extended, then Congress can pass all sorts of crazy laws that will actually affect our enterprises far worse than if we were under the purview of some unstable government. So 1898 does make one change, which is, again, that American businesses and investment interests just switch like a light's thrown once the two Foraker Acts pass, because there's a similar one in Cuba. The only difference is that the Cuban one, in essence, sort of works, has its desired effect of preventing formal annexation, and the Philippine one does not. But it does have the effect of preventing the rise of this group, and it does have the effect of turning business opinion against formal empire. But it doesn't turn business opinion against this informal empire. I guess there's a learning by doing story where soon, eventually, they realize that.
Yes, I was thinking, I mean, all of that makes sense to me. I was thinking, I mean, I was just doing a quick search on Wikipedia, and it looks like there were around 4,200 battle deaths, U.S. battle deaths in the Philippines during the insurrection. I mean, that's non-trivial, right?
It's huge. It's huge. And then the peak deployment is 75,000, which as a percentage of the population is pretty close to the peak deployments in Iraq. And so one thing that we've done is we've found the Philippine insurgent records in the National Archives. So these are all the internal records captured by the Filipinos. And we've only been cursorily looking them over, but it does seem as though the Filipinos are monitoring the election results in 1900. And they do seem to get really demoralized when the Republicans win, because they're really hoping for a Democratic victory in 1900. And they seem to be aiming their strategy around that. We haven't really figured out what exactly we can do with this. We're trying to think of a kind of an interesting.
Do you know Colin Moore's book on this? He was
Yes.
one of Dan Carpenter's students. Yeah. Well, we're almost at time. I just had one kind of crazy question. Well, not crazy, but just kind of like thinking outside the box question. I know the U.S. was kind of dabbling with annexing Santo Domingo in the 1870s, right, during the Grant administration. And there's a lot of votes in Congress and a lot of discussion in Congress. It doesn't happen. If that happens, how does that change things, you think? How does the path change?
One thing I want to just say here, just to reiterate for people who don't know about this episode, this could have happened. I mean, Grant blows it because he pisses off Charles Sumner and he insists on getting it through as a treaty, and then only switches to trying to do a joint resolution of Congress after it becomes clear that the treaty, he can't get 2/3 of the Senate to sign on. But he gets vote. He gets a 50-50 vote in a divided Senate. I mean, he just, if he'd adopted a different strategy of sequencing and then just not pissed Sumner off, he wasn't going to get Sumner's vote, but he didn't have to get Sumner angry at him. So like this really could have happened. And I'm not sure. I don't fully know. I mean, Leticia and I have sometimes gone back and forth on that. I mean, Reconstruction still would have happened. I don't.
We would play
don't
with
know.
that idea. Because like as Latin American, I'm just thinking like how the U.S. did not annex, DR and but I think as Noel says, it could have happened, and I think that would always have, to me, so would have strengthened the U.S. predisposition to be more imperialistic.
I mean, I suspect the involvement in Cuba still would have happened. Again, you get into sort of rapidly counterfactuals that just sort of keep multiplying. But I actually kind of strongly suspect that it would not have triggered more annexations. I think you would have had both a racist backlash because this is 1867. Reconstruction still would have happened. You still would have had a backlash. Latin Americans would have seen that Dominicans are not fully accepted. So maybe in the state of Santo Domingo, things are fine, but it's not like Dominicans then, move to New York and are treated like Italians.
Well, that was not nice in any case. So Italians were treated back then.
Yes.
So
Italians are still a protected category in the city university system. So
now in the city university in the city.
The city of New York. Yes, this is true.
Precise.
Yes. New York City has affirmative action programs for Italian Americans.
Because we were treated very poorly once upon a time.
Yes, you were. Okay. I'm a 5th generation New Yorker. There are like 4 of us, and I'm Jewish. And like, what? I mean, come on. What? Like, we had it so easy, and we don't. I mean, but yes. So I don't know. I don't know if it would have had that you could have made any predictable predictions about what a state of Santo Domingo would have been like. I mean, you also of course are going to have, it's a tropical economy with 2 senators who don't want competing interests inside the United States tariff wall. So I'm almost certain you're going to get two Senate votes against formal expansion from the state of Santo Domingo. And then you're going to get the negative reaction of other Latin Americans looking at the state of Santo Domingo and saying, well, they're still not being treated like full Americans. Yes, it's a state with senators, but it's like over there.
Yeah, but just overall we'll have it better, right? We always just make the case that, Puerto Rico is much better off than Costa Rica. So
yeah, but that's better off for Santo Domingo. It's like Jeff's question was, does it change the tenor of our policy in the rest of Latin America? And that's where I'm more skeptical, but it's hard to it's hard to say. And the other thing is, race relations in the Dominican Republic are fraught, as you know. It's certainly not going to lead to anything other than a militarized border with Haiti. It's not like that. And similarly in Cuba, I mean, the rebellion that the Americans intervened in 1912 is called the Rebellion Negra. I mean, that's what it's called. And it's racialized in Cuba, and Dominicans are going to be extremely aware of that dynamic next door and really reluctant to be in the same country with Cuba. So I suspect personally that the effect is going to be somewhere between no change and more reticence about expansion, rather than a sort of newfound American confidence that, Hispanic.
We don't agree on these things, but that's one take.
That's the only thing.
That's the opposite take.
Well, because from a Latin American point of view, just, yes, you just, maybe you're not treated the same way that, if you were like, just, I don't know, for one reason, I'm thinking Alabama, but for no good reason. But there's also some idea that if you're part of the US, sphere, you're gonna be better off. So it's a question of like how the elites are going to see themselves, being part of this project or not. And I'm, from a Latin American perspective, it's not clear that they're going to be so opposed, even if they're just not complete citizens or just not fully integrated. So we have to go back and forth all this.
Fair enough. Well, I think we're over time now.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks to Leticia and Noel, and thanks to Jane for providing great comments and feedback.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I definitely want to, if we can get offline for just any thoughts about how to deal with pre-trends, and sort of reformulating the abstract and the beginning part to sort of focus less on Afghanistan. It's mentally hard because it's sort of why we wrote this paper so quickly, but.
Yeah, but you wrote a book about imperialism. I don't think that's hard.
Okay, so
much for everybody.
I'm going to sign off here now.
For this period of time, and I hope I will see you.
Thanks again.
In person at some point in the near future.
Yes.
Thanks again.
Okay.
Thanks so much.